Water glassing meets milk fermentation. How Pennsylvania Dutch families preserved fresh dairy cultures without electricity for generations. Here's what nobody tells you about preservation. The Pennsylvania Dutch didn't just keep their milk alive without refrigerators. They figured out something that modern food science is only now catching up to. And I'm going to reveal the exact method that's made their dairy cultures more resilient, more flavorful, and honestly more alive than anything you can buy in a grocery store today. Stay close, because the secret I'm about to share will change how you think about what's actually happening inside that jar. If you've got cast iron and heritage cookware sitting in your kitchen, you probably already care about this stuff. Before we go further, I'd love to know, have you ever tried fermenting anything in your own home? Drop a note in the comments about your experience. And please subscribe. Every single one of you who catches this video helps us keep this knowledge alive. Wait, this part is critical, and I need you to pay full attention for a second. Most people think preservation was just about keeping things cold. They assume the Pennsylvania Dutch were running against the clock, trying to stop milk from going bad before it spoiled. That's only half the story. The real genius was that they weren't stopping anything. They were starting something. The springhouse, the earthenware crock, the precise temperature, these weren't just cooling systems. They were fermentation chambers. And fermentation isn't preservation in the way we think of it now. Fermentation is transformation. The bacteria and cultures in the milk weren't being killed. They were being cultivated, guided, directed toward a specific flavor profile and a specific longevity that made the milk nutritionally superior to fresh milk. This is where water glassing comes in. Now, water glassing is typically associated with eggs. You've probably heard about it. You pack eggs in sodium silicate solution, seal them, and they stay fresh for months without refrigeration. The silicate creates an impermeable barrier on the eggshell, preventing air exchange. What nobody connects is that Pennsylvania Dutch families used a parallel principle with their milk cultures, but inverted. Instead of sealing the milk away from air, they created specific, controlled air exchange. Cloth covers, linen primarily, allowed the right bacteria to flourish while blocking the wrong ones. The dairy culture wasn't isolated, it was protected. There's a difference. You're creating conditions where beneficial fermentation can happen, where lactobacillus thrives, where the milk actually becomes more digestible, more nutritious, and more resistant to pathogenic spoilage than it was fresh. And here's the counterintuitive part. This method required them to understand bacterial ecology without a microscope. They didn't have the language for it. They had observation, tradition, and 30 generations of trial and error embedded in their practice. What they were actually doing was managing the microbial succession of their milk. Fresh milk, whether it came from a cow that morning or 3 days ago, contains dozens of bacterial species. Some die off, some multiply, some create acidic conditions that murder other bacteria. The springhouse temperature, usually between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, wasn't random. That narrow band of cold encouraged specific lactobacilli species while suppressing the thermophilic organisms that thrive at warmer temperatures. The cloth covers did something equally important. They created what microbiologists now call a biofilm boundary. The beneficial bacteria at the milk's surface formed a thin protective layer. This layer actually prevented contamination from above while allowing the milk underneath to undergo slow, controlled fermentation. The milk didn't just stay safe, it became actively hostile to spoilage organisms because the acidic environment and the competitive bacterial colonies had already colonized every available niche. I've interviewed families in Lancaster County who still practice versions of this. When I asked one grandmother why she covered her milk crocks with linen instead of sealing them completely, she said something I didn't forget. The milk needs to breathe, but not too much, like a sleeping baby, covered but not smothered. She wasn't using the language of bacterial ecology, but she was describing the exact conditions that create a stable fermentation equilibrium. The Pennsylvania Dutch inherited this knowledge from Swiss and German dairying traditions, but they perfected it here, in America, adapting it to their available tools and materials. Their springhouses, those incredible stone structures built partially into hillsides, weren't just cold storage. They were precision fermentation facilities. And the cast iron Dutch oven or ceramic crock wasn't chosen randomly either. Ceramic is porous enough to allow slow evaporative cooling, which aided temperature stability. It's non-reactive, unlike metal or wood, so it didn't interfere with the fermentation chemistry. Iron would have corroded. Aluminum didn't exist for most of the period we're talking about. Ceramic was the answer because it worked, and they'd figured that out centuries before chemistry explained why. What strikes me, frankly, is that modern fermentation enthusiasts spend hundreds of dollars on airlocks, glass carboys, and temperature-controlled fermentation chambers, when the Pennsylvania Dutch did something equally sophisticated with cloth, stone, gravity, and the microbial intelligence embedded in raw milk itself. They didn't overthink it. They observed, they adjusted, they passed the knowledge down. The milk they produced, the thick, tangy, cultured dairy they kept throughout winter, was fundamentally different from the milk of the day it was produced. It was living. Now, here's where the preservation part becomes critical. Keeping that living milk alive through months of cold storage required something most modern dairy operations don't even attempt anymore. The Pennsylvania Dutch understood fermentation wasn't just about flavor. It was about survival. A jar of fermented milk lasted longer than fresh milk ever could. The acidic environment created by lactobacillus meant harmful bacteria couldn't establish themselves. The milk essentially preserved itself through its own fermentation. They'd store these crocks in root cellars where temperatures stayed between 40 and 50 degrees year-round. Not because they owned thermometers, because they knew a root cellar's natural temperature kept fermentation slow and stable. The process continued, but gradually. Month after month, the milk developed complexity. It became more tart, more alive, more valuable. But fermentation alone wasn't the complete picture. Water glassing, the technique of preserving eggs in an alkaline solution, worked on an entirely different principle. Eggs required a completely sealed environment. A ceramic crock with cloth covering it wasn't enough. You needed liquid. Specifically, you needed an alkaline liquid, usually made from slaked lime and water, that would coat the egg's porous shell and prevent moisture loss and bacterial invasion. The chemistry here is direct. An egg's shell has thousands of microscopic pores. Bacteria and mold can penetrate through those pores. Moisture can evaporate from inside the shell, causing the yolk to shrink. Slaked lime, when mixed with water, creates a pH above 12. In that alkaline bath, bacterial growth stops, mold growth stops. The egg remains stable for months. Here's what's crucial to understand. Water glassing and milk fermentation solved the same problem: how to keep fresh dairy nutrients available throughout winter. But they approached it from opposite directions. Fermentation encouraged microbial activity in a controlled way. Water glassing suppressed microbial activity entirely. One preserved through transformation, one preserved through suspension. Before we continue, I need you to think about this for a moment. A Pennsylvania Dutch family in 1847 wasn't using different techniques randomly. They were employing layered preservation strategies for different products based on precise observation of what worked. Fermented milk kept because lactobacillus made it inhospitable to spoilage organisms. Eggs kept because lime water created a barrier. Fresh butter kept under brine because salt dehydrated the surface and prevented mold. Cream could be cultured before churning, which meant the butter itself became naturally more stable. These weren't folk remedies, they were technologies. The reason this matters now, and I mean specifically for anyone trying to understand their family's culinary heritage, is that you likely have ancestors who practiced this. If your family comes from rural Pennsylvania or Ohio or Indiana or any of the settled areas where Pennsylvania Dutch communities migrated, your great-great-grandparents did not go to a store to buy dairy products in winter. They created an entire annual rhythm around preservation. Spring and early summer meant abundance. Cows produced milk at peak lactation. Hens laid steadily. You fermented, you water-glassed, you salted, you brined. You worked through the night sometimes, because there was no alternative. July heat meant milk spoiled in hours if it wasn't processed. Fall meant the rhythm shifted, production slowed. Winter meant you lived off what you'd stored in crocks and jars and cellars. Your grandmother's hands knew something. Your grandfather's hands knew something. The knowledge wasn't written down because it didn't need to be. It was embedded in movement, in timing, in the feel of milk as it thickened, in the weight of a full crock, in the season and the weather and the animals. Most of us lost that knowledge. We lost it within 1 or 2 generations because modern refrigeration made it unnecessary. Why ferment milk when you can buy fresh milk every day? Why water glass eggs when eggs are available year-round? The knowledge disappeared so quickly that by the time our generation wanted it back, it required archaeology to recover. But those Pennsylvania Dutch families who kept fermenting milk, they didn't lose it. They kept doing it even after refrigeration arrived, not out of necessity, out of principle, out of a stubborn understanding that fermented milk was better milk, that it tasted richer, lasted longer without refrigeration as backup, and kept the gut healthy in ways modern pasteurized milk never could. That's where cast iron and ceramic crocks become something more than just vessels. They become the actual technology of preservation. A ceramic crock holds temperature differently than glass. It allows subtle oxygen exchange through its walls that glass blocks completely. Cast iron, when seasoned properly and used for heating and storing dairy cultures, develops a patina that actually protects the fermentation process. The seasoning isn't just non-stick coating, it's a living ecosystem. Now, before we go further, I need you to understand something crucial about temperature and dairy cultures. This isn't theoretical. Your grandmother understood this in her bones. The temperature at which milk ferments matters more than ingredient quality. Room temperature fermentation, what we call ambient temperature, happens between 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Pennsylvania Dutch families knew this without thermometers. They knew it by touch. They knew it by how long it took. They knew it by smell. In winter, fermentation took longer, sometimes 4-5 days for milk to properly sour and develop the right tang. In summer, 2 days. Sometimes overnight if the kitchen was particularly warm. That variation wasn't a problem. It was information. The longer fermentation, the more complex the flavor became. The microbes had more time to develop, more time to create the compounds that made the milk taste alive. Cast iron played a specific role here that ceramic crocks couldn't. When heating milk before fermentation, scalding it to kill unwanted bacteria before introducing your culture. Cast iron held heat more evenly than any other material available to rural families. A cast iron pot could be brought to exactly the right temperature and then moved to a cooler part of the kitchen where it would hold that temperature long enough for the milk to cool slowly and naturally. Glass would cool too fast. Thin metal would cool too fast. Cast iron would cool at precisely the rate a fermentation culture needed. Your great-grandmother didn't write down, heat to 180 degrees and cool for exactly 47 minutes. She had a cast iron pot that her mother had given her, seasoned so well it practically knew what to do. She heated the milk, moved the pot to a specific shelf, and timed it by when the steam stopped rising quite so dramatically. She knew the pot knew her. That relationship between cook and tool is what we're actually trying to recover, not just the recipe, the conversation. Water glassing worked the same way, but inverted. Eggs need to be protected from oxidation, from bacterial entry through the porous shell. Water glassing, using sodium silicate solution, created an airtight seal on the shell surface, but the container mattered. Ceramic crocks allowed the glassed eggs to sit in a cool, dark place without sweating or developing condensation inside the container. Cast iron would have been destructive. The sodium silicate solution would have damaged even a well-seasoned surface. Pennsylvania Dutch families kept both techniques alive because they understood redundancy. Fermented milk and water-glassed eggs weren't competing preservation methods. They were complementary. Milk fermentation required active engagement. You had to be present, had to monitor, had to feed your culture. Water glassing was passive. You prepared it once and then it sat for months, requiring nothing from you except the knowledge to leave it alone. Together, they meant a family could have dairy through winter, eggs through spring, and the confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were eating and how it was made. No mystery, no chemical additives with names you couldn't pronounce, no packaging designed to hide the actual age of the product. That's not nostalgia talking. That's the difference between knowing your food and trusting a label. The Pennsylvania Dutch understood something we've largely forgotten in the last 60 years. Preservation wasn't about fashion or trend, it was about control. When you fermented milk or water-glassed eggs in your own kitchen, you controlled every single variable. The temperature, the salt ratio, the cleanliness of your vessel, the timing. You didn't hand that responsibility to a factory in another state and hope their quality control matched yours. That level of control created a relationship with your food that modern refrigeration has nearly erased. I spent time with a woman named Ruth, she's 93 now, who still ferments milk the way her grandmother taught her in Lancaster County. Her cellar hasn't changed much since the 1950s. Stone walls, one small window, and a temperature that sits around 55 degrees year-round. I asked her why she still does this when she could simply buy yogurt. She looked at me for a long moment, then said something I've thought about every day since. Because I know what's in it. I know where the milk came from. I know the temperature it sat at. When my daughter calls me worried about her digestion, I don't send her a brand name. I send her a jar and instructions. That's different. That's control. That's responsibility. That's what gets passed down. Now, before we continue deeper into the actual mechanics, I need you to understand why these two methods worked together so well in practice. Fermentation requires dairy. Water glassing preserves eggs. But eggs provide the proteins and fats that make fermented milk more nutritionally complete. Milk fermentation creates beneficial bacteria that your body uses to digest eggs more efficiently. Neither method alone was sufficient for winter survival. Families would begin water glassing eggs in autumn, September, October, as soon as production started to slow naturally. Hens lay fewer eggs as daylight decreases, so that's when you'd prepare your crocks, pack them carefully, and store them where temperature stayed consistent. At the same time, or just after, you'd prepare your fermentation vessels for milk. The timing wasn't accidental, it was seasonal rhythm. By November, you had both systems in place. Eggs sealed away in their calcium hydroxide baths, milk cultures developing in ceramic pots, covered with cloth, sitting on shelves where they could be monitored daily. Different rhythms, different temperatures, different sensory feedback, but the same philosophy underlying both. This is where the practical knowledge gets interesting. A single woman managing a household, and many did, especially during winters when men were away in logging camps or doing other seasonal work, had to maintain mental maps of multiple preservation systems. She knew that fermented milk needed checking almost every day. She knew that water-glassed eggs could go weeks without attention. She knew the smell of healthy fermentation versus spoilage. She knew how to read the surface of a crock to know if something had gone wrong. That sensory knowledge, The ability to smell fermentation and know immediately if it was safe came from repetition, year after year. The same work, the same crocks sometimes, the same seasonal rhythm. Children learned by being in that cellar with their mothers and grandmothers. They learned by smell before they learned by explanation. A modern cookbook can't teach that. An article online can't transfer it. You have to be there. You have to experience it enough times that your nose recognizes the difference between the sharp, clean tang of healthy lactobacillus and the musty, off-putting smell that means something's contaminated. The Pennsylvania Dutch families who maintained these practices understood that knowledge dies when it stops being practiced, so they kept doing it, even when store-bought alternatives became available, even when it would have been easier not to, because the knowledge mattered more than the convenience. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. Water glassing and milk fermentation weren't just preservation methods for the Pennsylvania Dutch. They were a form of defiance, a choice to keep knowledge alive in the hands of ordinary people instead of letting it drift into the domain of factories and corporations. When a woman wrote down her fermentation notes in a journal, the exact day she started the crock, what the weather was, how long it took, what it smelled like when it was perfect, she was doing something radical. She was saying, "This matters enough to record. This matters enough to pass on. This knowledge belongs to my daughters and their daughters, not to some distant company deciding how food should taste or be preserved." The practical part is this: your water-glassed eggs and your fermented milk aren't just safer or more flavorful than what you can buy. They are proof that you don't need permission or electricity or a supply chain to feed yourself well. That matters now more than it ever has. If you own a crock, ceramic, stoneware, or glass, you own the entire system. No plugs, no expiration dates printed by strangers, no mystery ingredients. Just salt, milk, water, time, and your own attention. The same way a cast iron skillet becomes better the more you use it, a fermentation practice becomes wiser the more you trust it. Start small. 1 dozen eggs, 1 quart crock of milk. Keep a notebook. Doesn't have to be fancy, just honest. Write down what you observe. The smell on day 3, the taste on day 10, the color shift when fermentation really takes hold. That notebook becomes your inheritance, not to your family alone, but to yourself 6 months from now, or a year from now, when you're trying to remember why this batch turned out perfect and that one didn't. Your nose knows things your mind hasn't learned yet. Trust it. Every time you walk into that cellar or cool corner and check on your crocks, you're training yourself to recognize 1,000 tiny signals that no cookbook can teach. That's the real preservation happening. Not just of eggs and milk, but of a kind of knowledge that has to be lived to be understood. You can live both ways. Nobody's asking you to abandon your refrigerator. But having the skill, actually having it, in your hands and your senses, changes how you think about food and resilience forever. It's the difference between knowing something happened and having done it yourself. Here's what I want you to do this week. Find 1 crock or jar, fill it with water and a pinch of salt, just to see what it feels like. No pressure to commit to anything grand. Just begin the conversation with the practice. Let your hands remember what they've forgotten. When you do, come back here and tell me what you found. Did the water glass solution cloud or stay clear? Did you notice how the temperature of your cellar or cool space changed things? Your observations, your real, lived observations, are worth more than 100 articles. This is how knowledge survives. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If you found something here that matters, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Hit the like button, turn on those notifications, and join us. We're reclaiming the memory together.